Okay, so I want to talk about positionality and epistemology, which we've actually already been talking about, but not calling it that. So we already did this part about what brings us here today, what you're working on, what interests us and you, and why, and what are the connections between us and our research efforts. And just to share a little bit, my most recent project, which is a really long-term project, I interviewed about 100 women in the Roman Catholic tradition who actually defied canon law, which is the law regulating the Catholic Church, and went ahead and got ordained as priests, because the Catholic Church refuses to ordain women as priests, so they decided they would just break canon law. And so it's a fascinating, to me, narrative project, because my question is, how do women create change in patriarchal institutions? And it's not so much that I have a particular stake in women being ordained. I do think it's kind of what would I say? I think the reasoning behind not ordaining women is sort of easily analyzed as being, sort of a facade for, well, we don't do it because we just don't want to ordain women, and because it's a men's club, but they don't say it that way. But I was raised Catholic, and so I had enough of a connection to that to sort of look into it and find that this was a really interesting kind of movement, a sort of somewhat feminist movement. I mean, it's feminist in some regards. It holds back a little bit on some of the feminisms. So it's kind of on the edge of wave 2, kind of heading into a little bit of wave 3 feminisms. But I had a personal connection to that. I understood where these women were coming from. I understood why they were pushing for change. And I totally support women and all people organizing for changes that are more inclusive, that are more just, that are more equitable. The larger sort of global reason is that the Roman Catholic Church has a lot of resources. It's a global institution, and when it sees fit to justify exclusionary practices, that sends a message globally sort of about what is right. And we saw this earlier on, to a certain extent still see it, but we see it earlier on with family violence and religious institutions actually sort of protecting, some decades ago, protecting the right of particularly men to be violent toward female partners and toward children. Right? It was justified under the a home is a man's castle kind of paradigm. And so when religious institutions do that, so it's not per se necessarily the religion, but it's the religious institution that does that. I'm very much supportive of people organizing for change to make things more equitable. From your introductions, and you're talking about the work that you're doing, you can see that there are personal connections to this. And so positionality makes a difference. So what is positionality? So we can talk about it broadly as social, political, economic, geographic contexts that shape the development of the individual and their identities, and group identities, groups to which they belong, often in intersecting constructs of race, ethnicity, class, gender expression, affectional orientation, sexualities, abilities, religion, national origin, legal status, and I really should have used an ellipsis there, kind of a ... It's so important that we understand that we have these multiple identities and where they come from and how they've shaped us. They shape and influence our experiences, what experiences we have access to, how we understand our world. And, a very simple example I can give you of how positionality really shapes a lens, kind of outside of the realm of research. My life partner is a Mexican citizen, a dual citizen with the US, but Mexican in origin. And so my children are Mexican American, and I have on occasion gotten stopped by the cops, for traffic whatevers. And I never think twice about it partly because of generation and age, but a lot because I am a white cisgender female and I'm educated. When the police stop me, my first reaction is dismay, not fear. When my son was learning to drive one time and I got stopped, he froze. He was like, uh-oh, what's going to happen here? Am I going to get pulled out of the car? He had a totally different reaction to this. And that's just an example of positionality. My positionality versus my child's positionality is very, very different. And it's different because of the meaning that our society and our contexts give to being white versus being brown. He knows very much, like I can get stopped by a cop and I can engage in a little bit of social banter. He would never think of doing that. It's like, I got to minimize my interaction. I don't want this to go any further than what, kind of, what's your question, officer, kind of thing. That's an example really just about how who we are, who our identities, what identity claims we have, and how those interact with the context we're in, can really shape our lens and shape our experiences. And by the way, just because I'm doing PowerPoint doesn't mean you can't speak up and say something, okay? You don't have to go silent. So here's something you've probably seen in the course of your higher education, or maybe you saw it even in high school. Here, it's just one kind of portrait of the wheel of power and privilege, right? And if you have power at the center and you see who's in the center or which identities are close to the center of power, right? So even when I put myself on this wheel, and of course I'm pointing to it because it's on my other monitor, so just so you know what I'm doing here. When I look at this and I look at that center wheel, there's only two places where I'm not right in the center circle of power, and that is I'm not a cisgender man and I'm not rich. And when I say I'm not rich, I mean I have to work for a wage. I have to work for a living. I'm old enough to think about my Social Security. I'm not rich in the sense that I have plenty of access to economic resources without having to work, right? But that's out of something like 12 little pieces there in the center, 12 sets of identities. I have 10 out of 12 of those. That makes me incredibly privileged, right? And we all know what those at least I know what those privileges are in a lot of contexts, right? I can walk into any kind of retail setting and not get followed by a clerk. I can walk around on campus, and wear a hoodie, and nobody thinks that that's some sort of sign of me trying to get away with something illegal. There are just, and there's myriad of privileges that go along with that. And so the more we travel outward, in a sense, this is a research term, but I'm going to use it differently. The further we get away from that center of power, the fewer degrees of freedom there are. In that center circle, there's a lot of degrees of freedom. I have a lot of freedom of mobility. When I go to the airport, I'm just sort of like ordinary person traveling through security. When my husband goes through security, he'll be right with me. He'll be right behind me. Every single piece of thing he's carrying on an airplane will get searched. And that includes particularly his case with all the camera equipment in it, right? Because who knows what he's bringing onto an airplane. He'll get extra swipes many more times than I will. I think I've gotten it maybe once in a dozen times, whereas he'll get it probably 8-10 times out of a dozen that he travels. So the further out we go, right, there are what I call fewer degrees of freedom. There's more surveillance. And that includes surveillance from research. And the gaze of research in general always tends to be toward folks with identities on the outer ring of this wheel of power and privilege. The gaze of research very rarely goes towards that center group, right? If in any social science work that you've done, how often have you seen actual primary data research on the wealthy? Like, when was the last time you heard a dissertation proposal and somebody said, yes, I plan to interview, 75 very rich people, very rich white people. They're not even going to give you the time of day. You wouldn't even have access to them. How many times has John Huntsman been included in, social science research in the state of Utah? So what we know about people in this sort of second set of identities out from the center, and the third is much more than we know about people in that first inner circle. So the gaze of research itself has a positional bias to it. Okay. Do you have any thoughts about this kind of portrait of power and privilege? Is it stuff you've ever thought about research?
On the other hand, like, the marginalized communities are often forgotten in research as well in like product development and in implementation. So that's, I think, when we're doing research on a specific demographic, I think that's where you'll see research done on the marginalized communities. But when you're just doing generic research, that's where I think you'll probably get less of that, and more of that inner circle.
Yep. Excellent point. It's a double-edged sword. You're absolutely right. So generally speaking, that outer circle of power and privilege here is neglected in certain kinds of research and overstudied in other kinds of research. And there are some inherent positional biases even in the way those people in those communities are studied. A really good book to read, by the way, if you haven't already, is Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington. An absolutely phenomenal book, an amazing piece of scholarship in my view. What does she call it? The Dark History of Medical Experimentation and Abuse on African Americans in the US. Absolutely stupendous. So if you want to get a real view of how exactly what you're saying, CJ, sort of that double-edged sword of overstudying and understudying. A lot of times overstudying when there's higher risk involved in the research. And that's what she points out in some 450 pages of amazing scholarship. So yeah, that's an excellent point. Okay, so now the question comes, how does positionality shape epistemology? And so what we want to know is, how does who we are and all the identities and intersections we bring to the table in research affect what we know and how we know? And to ask this question, I have to say it's not a popular question to ask, because it does tend to disrupt the cherished conventional notions about objectivity in research. So epistemology, I'm sure you all know this, because you all have a lot of good research experience. Excuse me. Epistemology is a study of how we know and what's the nature of knowing. We tend to think we know what objectivity is. How, from the research you've done, how do you think about objectivity in research? Ooh, you're awfully silent.
With my experience, I mean, I've encountered already a lot of perhaps incorrect assumptions that a lot of like previous like labor studies and social examinations of like recruitment practices that are just that they're inherently neutral. And that's kind of been the big standout to me in terms of just kind of assumed objectivity, that there's sort of a correlation between objectivity and a feeling of like authority on a subject. And it's very difficult to dissuade that feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, so objectivity is an assumption in research, right? That we can actually do research from a value neutral standpoint, and we can control our positionalities, or any biases, any preconceived notions that we have. And that's an assumption that really does come under question. Part of the assumption underlying objectivity is that we're dealing with objects and that they are objects we can control, which when you're in social science research, it really has to go out the window. But even in STEM research, there are many ways in which our positionality shapes the way we do the research. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. So we've talked about some of our positionality claims, or at least I've talked about some of mine. Some of you have mentioned them along the way in discussion. And so, what are the connections we can make from our positionality claims to what we actually know? And I gave you that example with the police, my son versus myself, right? What I think I know about the police is totally shaped by my positionality, my identity claims. And what he knows, and in fact is anxious about, fears about the police, is totally shaped by his identity claims and positionalities, okay? But this flows over into research. It's not just about everyday living. So it does make a difference, who we are to what we think we know, and to actually be a little bit humble about it too, which is always an interesting thing in research. So Gringeri and company in the Dictionary of Human Geography, I think, define positionality as the fact that if researchers' social, cultural, and subject positions and other psychological processes affect the questions they ask and how they frame them. And I'd go before step one, and I'd say they also affect the literature that's reviewed and the way it is reviewed, the way it's analyzed. It affects researchers' relationships or relations with those they research in the field or through interviews, and the interpretations they place on empirical evidence. Just think about the way typically post-positivist research deals with anomalous data, right? Outliers. We just get rid of them. In qualitative research, we don't. We say, what do we learn from something that looks like an outlier? In post-positivist research, we say, yeah, that's not what I set out to look at. I'm just looking at this. Okay. It shapes access to data, institutions, outlets for research dissemination and funding, which is hugely important. And it shapes the likelihood that they will be listened to and heard. So relative to point number 4, look, for example, some people particularly in, I think it's in organizational literature, but also to a certain extent in social sciences, are starting to look at citation bias. Exactly whose work is cited in the research, and to what extent are BIPOC researchers getting the same attention for their research that dominant Anglo-white researchers are getting in terms of citation. And citations make a big difference to a person's career. It makes a big difference to whether they can get funding. It makes a big difference as to whether their research is actually even seen. It talks about whether they will be listened to and heard. Okay. So from A to Z in research, and I'm keeping an eye on the time here, it's critical that researchers monitor our positionality and how it shapes our work. In my research, for example, because I tend to do qualitative research, I tend to cast the net broadly and do the sifting when I'm doing analysis. I don't cast out data. I look at all of it together to see what sort of big picture I can put together. But I have to keep, for example, a log of like the decisions and choices that I make along the way in research, so that I can keep myself accountable for what I'm actually doing, for the literature that I'm looking at, for the ways in which I share my research, etc. So in reviewing literature, for example, how broadly do you go? Do you only look at certain lines of research? How did the research questions come about? I know we often think that, we do an objective look at the literature and then we develop research questions based on the gaps that we identify, which is true to a certain extent. But a lot of times we notice only the gaps that we think are actually viable research questions. Well, in other words, I think I can carry that one off. I think I can answer this one. So we attend to this question, but not that question. Methods and design are another huge area in which our positionality shape us, and we need to be reflexive. And when I say reflexive, it's being self-reflective about who I am, what I bring to the table, and how it's shaping, for example, methods and design. Data collection and analysis is another one. When I teach qualitative methods, for example, I have students do a small pilot project, and usually they will do a small interview-based data collection project. And I'll say, so come up with the questions that based on, what you want to answer in your research question, the questions you will go and ask people as you interview them. But before you go out and do that, I want you to do two things. I want you to hand those questions over to somebody, that who you trust, and they interview you using the same questions. So you can hear what they sound like to your participants. And then I also want you, after you do that, to do some revising and thinking and reflecting. And then I want you to take that revised interview protocol, and I want you to go interview somebody, who would fit the inclusion criteria of your project, and interview them and let them give you feedback as well. I also want you to think about your inclusion criteria. Who's included in this study and who isn't? Whose perspective are we going for, and whose perspective is left out of this? Who do we assume, are going to be the beneficiaries or the people affected by the research we're doing? Because that affects how we do the research and how we carry it out. So I always have students, and this is really becoming, I think, a more typical and expected in qualitative research, not necessarily in post-positivist research, though. I ask people to track your decisions. How did you make them? Why did you make them? How did you justify those decisions throughout the process, so that we can be apparent about the links between our positionality and the works we produce? And publications should actually include a statement to address this. And what's really interesting is that a lot of times journals don't want to see that statement. Even qualitative research journals oftentimes don't want to see that. They feel like it detracts from, quote unquote, the objective nature of research. But particularly in the social sciences, we don't research objects, we research social phenomena and the people involved in them. And so our research has to account for human subjectivity, and for humans to be subjects acting in their own rights as agents of change, however they see that, however they define that. I think that might be that's my last slide. So I know we're really close to the top of the hour. So any comments or questions that you'd like to sort of interject here as a last thought?
This is River. This is more so related to your current research, so I hope I'm not detracting. But if it is of interest to you, my dear friend is Kate Kelly, and if the ordained women movement is of interest to you, I can certainly connect you. So let me know.
Hey, thank you so much. My former research assistant who was on this project with me and helped me quite a bit was actually formerly LDS and actually did connect with Kate Kelly, but I actually would like to talk with her again. I have to just give you my little spiel because it's a topic I'm passionate about. So ordained women versus the Roman Catholic women priests is really quite interesting. And I don't think Kate Kelly's associated with ordained women anymore. Is that right, River?
Correct.
Yeah, I think there was I remember there was a sort of exiting process because I think of getting excommunicated from the church, and ordained women has wanted to stay sort of, even if marginal, right within the boundaries of the LDS church, whereas the Roman Catholic women priests are excommunicated the minute they get ordained. And so they are sort of traveling the margins outside of the sort of formal institutional boundaries of Roman Catholicism. But yes, I might get in touch with you. Maybe Shiver could give you my email. It'd be fun to just actually sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk with her about both of the movements. Thank you.
Yes, you bet.
Yeah. Any other last minute comments? Okay, well, listen, it was great to meet all of you. I'm excited to hear about the research you're doing and some of the critical lenses that you're bringing to it. It's really wonderful to hear that. So good luck with all your work and with your educational and professional endeavors.
Thank
you. I could stop
Thank
sharing.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just as a reminder for everyone on this call, I did drop the link to the evaluation form into the chat. We always appreciate your feedback. I apologize profusely for being so late. And as a reminder for those watching this video later, please go to the top of the education series page and fill out that evaluation form with your unit so that I can make sure to check off that you have in fact watched this video for your attendance.